Council, are we ready? Council?
Yes, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to today's hearings of the Yoorrook Justice Commission. Today we continue our inquiry into land injustice in hearing block 6. It is the last day of these hearings here in Collingwood and before we conclude the hearing block. But I would like to invite Commissioner Hunter to give welcome to country before we begin our business.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri, the unceded stolen lands of the Wurundjeri. Pay my respects to my elders, my ancestors, both past and present, to other Aboriginal people watching online, and particularly our elders that are watching online. May Bunjil, our Creator Spirit, watch over us as we conduct today's hearings, and Wominjeka.
Thank you, Commissioner Hunter. To have appearances, please, Council.
Thank you, Chair. I appear led by Mr McAvoy of Senior Counsel to assist the Royal Commission. I also acknowledge and thank Commissioner Hunter for her welcome, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this country, the Wurundjeri people. I do that both as a member of Council assisting and also as a Yuin person from the southeast coast of New South Wales. I'd invite other parties to announce their appearances.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Gemma Caffarella and I appear on behalf of the State of Victoria. On behalf of the State, I'd like to thank Commissioner Hunter for the welcome this morning. The State acknowledges that today's hearings are being held on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and we acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land. I'll start again, sorry, Commissioners. My name's Gemma Caffarella and I appear on behalf of the State of Victoria. And on behalf of the State, I'd like to thank Commissioner Hunter for her welcome this morning. The State acknowledges that today's hearings are being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and acknowledges them as the traditional owners of this land. The State acknowledges that sovereignty was never ceded over this land. I pay my respect to Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and I acknowledge all First Nations people here today, especially the elders and also those who are watching online. The State acknowledges the pain and trauma inherent in the truth-telling process and in particular in the topics that will be raised today, and acknowledges the ongoing spirit and resistance of First Nations people in the face of what they've experienced. Thank you.
May it please the Commission, my name is Strawn. I appear with the leave of the Commission for Reverend Fotheringham, who's the moderator of the Uniting Church in Australia, Synod of Victoria and Tasmania, for whom I also hear. Can I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land on which we're gathered today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and offer my respects to the First Peoples present in the room and online. And could I thank Commissioner Hunter for the welcome also.
Thank you.
Please, Commission. My name is Annesley. I appear on behalf of the Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne. His Grace has indicated that he will do the acknowledgements and welcomes on behalf of the an acceptance welcome on behalf of the Archdiocese. Thank you.
There is no legal representative here today to represent the Anglican Church, so I'd invite Bishop Treloar and Bishop Blackwell to respond to the acknowledgement to country if they wish.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. Is this the opportunity for the opening statement? Or?
Just in terms of the acknowledgement.
Yeah, on behalf of the Anglican Province of Victoria, we'd like to thank Commissioner Hunter for her welcome to country. Thank you.
Thank you. I might just then first have everyone introduce themselves and make an undertaking or oath to tell the truth to this Yoorrook Justice Commission in whatever shape or form. I might start just with you, Bishop Richard, I should say, instead of Bishop Treloar. Bishop Richard, if you could please introduce yourself to the commissioners.
Thank you very much. Richard Treloar, Anglican Bishop of the Diocese of Gippsland. Been in ministry since 1990, all in Victoria, in Ballarat Diocese, Melbourne Diocese, and for the last 6 years in Gippsland.
And do you, would you prefer to take an oath or undertaking?
Just your normal procedure.
Yes. Do you undertake to tell the truth to this Yoorrook Justice Commission today?
Do.
Thank you. And Bishop Genevieve, if you could introduce yourself to the commissioners, please.
I'm Genevieve Blackwell. I'm an assistant bishop in the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne. I've been in the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne for the last 8 years. Prior to that, I was a regional bishop and in parish ministry in the Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn. I've been in ordained ministry for 31 years now. Most of that has been in New South Wales and in various dioceses, largely in Wiradjuri country, but I actually did train in Sydney as well and served there initially.
And Bishop Genevieve, do you undertake to tell the truth to the Yoorrook Justice Commission today?
I do.
And then turning to Reverend David, if you could please introduce yourself to the commissioners.
Thank you, Council. I'm David Fotheringham, the moderator of the Uniting Church Synod of Victoria and Tasmania. I was born on Kaurna country in Adelaide, now live on Wurundjeri country. I've been an ordained minister since the year 2000 and have been in the role of moderator for the last 2 years.
And Reverend David, would you prefer to do an undertaking or?
That's fine.
Do you undertake to tell the truth to this Yoorrook Justice Commission?
Yes, I do.
And then if I can turn to Reverend Peter, Archbishop Peter, sorry. If you could please introduce yourself to the commissioners.
Hello, commissioners. Can I just first say, Commissioner Hunter, thank you for the welcome to country, and we also pay our respects and honour the Wiradjuri people and the ongoing concerns that are there, but also the importance of seeking justice and reconciliation. So thank you very much. I'm Peter Comensoli. I'm the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne. I've been in this role since August 2018. I originally came from New South Wales but now Archbishop of Melbourne.
Thank you. And I understand that you'd like to take an oath.
If that's okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you swear to tell the truth to the Yoorrook Justice Commission?
I do.
And then Mr. O'Leary, if you could introduce yourself to the commissioners.
Commissioner Hunter, thank you very much for your gracious welcome to country. Very much appreciated. I am the Executive Director of Stewardship for the Archdiocese of Melbourne, and I've been in this role for the last 4 years.
Very much. And do you swear to tell the truth to this Yoorrook Justice Commission?
So I do.
Thank you very much. Each of the churches has prepared a submission that have been provided to the Commission. The submissions of the Uniting and Catholic churches, as the Commissioners will be aware, are subject to a number of Section 26 non-publication claims. Those particular claims will be dealt with by the Commissioners at a later date, but my questions won't traverse the detail of the material that is subject to those claims for the purposes of today. So
Goodwin,
yes.
we'll simply stand over each of those Section 26 applications to a later date.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I'll there are no claims made over the submission made by the Anglican Church. Two relevant submissions have been made. One submission has been prepared by 4 out of 5 of the dioceses located in Victoria. Those are the dioceses of Melbourne, Bendigo, Wangaratta and Gippsland. That is the submission that Bishops Richard and Genevieve will speak to. So I tender that submission. The Diocese of Ballarat has also prepared a separate submission. No claims are made over that submission, and I tender that submission as well, Chair.
Thank you.
I now would like to invite each of the representatives of the churches who have prepared an opening statement to deliver that opening statement. This is, I promise, no favouritism, but I will start in the order in which I allowed people to introduce themselves as well. So if I can invite Bishop Richard to read his opening statement on behalf of him and Bishop Genevieve.
Tim. Chair, Commissioners, Bishop Genevieve Blackwell and I acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Kulin Nations and pay our respects to elders past and present of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, Boonwurrung and Wadawurrung peoples on whose country the Diocese of Melbourne serves, and to all First Nations people here in person or watching online. On behalf of the Anglican Province of Victoria, we acknowledge traditional owners of all lands on which our 5 autonomous, interdependent dioceses operate. All signatories to the written submission from Melbourne, Bendigo, Wangaratta and Gippsland, including the Archbishop, represented by Bishop Genevieve, echo what follows as it applies in their context. And we note that the Diocese of Ballarat has made a separate submission. I speak today primarily for the Diocese of Gippsland, and so pay my respects to the Gunai Kurnai, Boonwurrung, Bidawal and Ngarigo Monero peoples, whose sovereignty over the land and waterways of that region has never been ceded. Gippsland Anglicans lament that our colonial history includes atrocities committed against First Peoples, and that some of those involved in these heinous but no longer unspeakable acts are likely to have identified with the Church of England. Of this terrible legacy, we repent. The Anglican Church in Gippsland has been complicit in and has benefited from the dispossession and other harms caused by Victoria's colonisation, predicated in part on the theologically repugnant and now repudiated doctrine of discovery and its outworking in the morally bankrupt ideology of terra nullius. We recognise with sorrow that the forced relocation of First Peoples from country to and from missions at Lake Tyers and Rumayak caused separation from family, language and culture, and has led to intergenerational trauma. Gippsland Anglicans are committed to truth-telling as an essential condition of reconciliation, as expressed in our diocesan vision. We are encouraged and challenged on this journey by the leadership of 2 Aboriginal priests who work in their communities, mostly outside the church. The Reverend Canon Auntie Phyllis Andy was made a canon of our cathedral in 2021. The Reverend Kathy Dalton was appointed to our peak governing body, Bishop in Council, in 2023, and both have given their blessing to this statement. The diocese will continue to support Aboriginal ministry, including through proceeds from land sales, and to partner with our Anglican agencies and schools in their empowering of Victoria's First Peoples. In 1988, the Anglican primate publicly apologised to the national Aboriginal bishop for the suffering that his people have had to endure with its violence and hurt. In 1998, General Synod apologised for the Anglican Church's part, not least through our silence, in the litany of wrongs documented by the Bringing Them Home report. With other Victorian dioceses, we reiterate these apologies today, grateful for the opportunity to engage with the Commission as a further step towards a more hopeful future by addressing past injustice, what one of my predecessors has called the unhealed wound in the soul of our Church and nation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bishop. Now invite Reverend David.
Thank you. Can I first of all add my thanks to Commissioner Hunter for the welcome to country this morning. I begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we are gathered. I pay respect to their elders, past and present, and I offer my respects to all First Peoples present in this room and online. I acknowledge that this land has not been ceded by First Peoples and that First Peoples sovereignty continues, as eloquently described in the Statement from the Heart. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this commission on behalf of the Uniting Church in Australia, Synod of Victoria and Tasmania. The Uniting Church supports the objectives of Yoorrook and the process of truth-telling, record-making, developing understanding, and making recommendations for healing and practical change. This is certainly an historic moment for Victoria, and I trust and hope that this will be a significant step towards the development of treaty. The Uniting Church acknowledges that it is a beneficiary of the dispossession of land from First Peoples, and that historical Crown grants of land were made with no consideration of First Peoples sovereignty, connection to the land, or rights. We acknowledge that the churches which came to form the Uniting Church were involved in missions in ways that harmed or rejected First Peoples' culture, language, spiritual wisdom, and connection with country. As part of our journey in truth-telling and understanding, we accepted an invitation into a covenant with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress in 1994. With their leadership, in 2009, the Uniting Church in Australia adopted a revised preamble to our Constitution. The preamble expressly acknowledges that many in the churches which formed the Uniting Church shared the values of the emerging colonial society, including paternalism and racism towards First Peoples, and were complicit in the injustice that resulted in the dispossession of land, language, culture, and spirituality. The change to the preamble also reflects our commitment to praying and working for reconciliation, together with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. Today, the vision of the Synod of Victoria and Tasmania is following Christ, walking together as First and Second Peoples, seeking community, compassion, and justice for all creation. Accordingly, we look forward to Yoorrook's findings and recommendations and are committed to working cooperatively towards a more just future for First Peoples.
Thank you.
Very much. Archbishop Peter, I now invite you to present your opening statement.
Thank you. And Chair and Commissioners, I am grateful that I can be here today and to be able to engage with you through this session of the Commission, and say thank you. I just reiterate my acknowledgement and thanks once again, Commissioner Hunter, and acknowledge and honour, I think that word is important, the Wurundjeri people on whose lands and ways we are present at the moment. Thank you for including the Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne in this session of the Yoorrook Justice Commission, which forms part of the first people's-led truth-telling inquiry in Victoria, and for permitting us to make this brief introductory statement. You are aware that the Archdiocese has provided a more extensive submission in response to the various questions of the Commission, and we look forward to being able to speak to that submission in our session today, including the acknowledgements of apologies and actions of reconciliation that are named within that document. We recognise that the word Catholic is appended to many entities, institutions and ministries operating within Victoria. But it is also to be acknowledged that the structures and geographic limits of the Archdiocese of Melbourne, for whom I speak, will not be well known to many Victorians, and perhaps not to the Commissioners yourselves. For this reason, allow me to just take a moment to offer some clarification which might help in terms of our engagement as we're going along today. In general terms, the Catholic Church in Australia is administratively and geographically divided into 7 archdioceses, 21 dioceses, and 5 eparchies. Each diocese is under the jurisdiction of a bishop, and an archdiocese, such as Melbourne, under the leadership of an archbishop. According to the 2021 census, 136,000 Catholics identified themselves as Catholics, as Indigenous throughout Australia. That's roughly, I gather, around 2.7% of all Catholics within Australia. But that's about 16.7% of Indigenous in Australia, and I think that's also a significant number to be acknowledging today. In general terms, the Catholic Church in Australia, as I said, is administered in both geographic and jurisdictional efforts. The Archdiocese of Melbourne is the largest of those dioceses in Australia by population, at least, with some 1 million people identifying as Catholic in the last census. Over 5,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders identified themselves as Catholic in the Archdiocese of Melbourne from that census as well. Just some facts that might be not necessarily known. The Archdiocese of Melbourne, however, covers only a relatively small area of the state of Victoria, some 27,000 square kilometres. And there are 3 other dioceses in Victoria, being Ballarat, Sandhurst and Sale dioceses. Each is a separate church jurisdiction, and as such, I do not speak on their behalf today. The Catholic Church's presence in Melbourne is not reducible to a single entity. It is rather a community of realities embracing the running of parishes and churches, pastoral centres, health and aged care facilities, schools, universities, welfare services, prison ministries, and much, much more. This extensive charitable and formational outreach is not solely undertaken by the Archdiocese of Melbourne, but there are very many discrete entities involved. Catholic Church is also comprised of many religious congregations or institutes who undertake outreach under their own jurisdiction and governance. Although we share a common faith, as with other dioceses, I cannot speak on their behalf of those groups. I hope that these small clarifying remarks can assure the Commission in helping to foster our understanding together today. And again, I thank the commissioners for inviting us to be present for this meeting.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Peter. Using that as a springboard, and the Catholic Church have answered this question in their opening statement, but just to provide an opportunity to each of the other churches, the submissions do discuss the current structure of the church and its operation in Victoria for each of your churches. But just by way of quick summary, if each of you could briefly describe to the commissioners the structure of the church in Victoria and how it operates. And I might just provide an opportunity first to Bishop Richard. Yes, thank you, Bishop Geneve. Yes.
So there are 5 dioceses in the province of Victoria, and they are separately governed, and but as Bishop Richard mentioned, there is a collegiality and an interdependence. We have a provincial council, but each diocese is separate in terms of its governance, headed by the Archbishop of Melbourne for the Diocese of Melbourne, who is also the Metropolitan of the province. And then there is 4 regional bishops for each of the regional dioceses, Ballarat, Bendigo, Wangaratta and Gippsland. The submission outlines how those 4 regional dioceses were effectively carved out of what was the Diocese of Melbourne originally. The other thing to mention, I think particularly, is that similar to the Catholic Church, there are separate agencies. Each of Anglican schools, they are each a separate entity on their own, as well as welfare agencies, and there's also an aged care facility. That's particularly aged care, Benetas. That's particular to, I suppose, within the area of Melbourne. In terms of other dioceses, regional dioceses, some of those things might be or have been historically interdependent more with the diocese. The Melbourne diocese, that separation occurred in terms of schools a number of decades ago. In terms of our welfare agencies, they have tended to be separate. Is there anything you would add in terms of the governance?
It might just be worth adding on that last point that we continue to have a significant role in terms of governance and chaplaincy with those partner organisations, agencies and schools. So it continues to be a shared ministry, even if they're separate as kind of self-determining organisations.
And I would also add that the things like you see where the Archbishop, for example, is president of the Anglican Victoria Council, of which the board is accountable to, gives you some of the nuance of it.
And my understanding is that each diocese is an assembly of mostly elected representatives known as a synod.
That's right. It's so for example, in Melbourne, it's the Archbishop in synod, and synod is elected representatives from each of the parishes of the diocese, and the clergy are also members of synod, and there may be other people summoned for various reasons to synod as part of the membership.
That's how it works from a governance perspective. I guess there's a deeper sense in which the diocese simply comprises all of the clergy and people who identify as Anglican in that region. And
one of the responsibilities of synod is to pass acts of synod which are binding on clergy. Is that right? Yes.
They're binding on clergy. I'd say they're also binding on the parishes as well. And so when I say the parishes, I mean the parish leadership. Each parish has a parish council, and office holders are expected to abide by the acts of synod as well.
And there's also a national general synod, which is headed by a president known as the primate. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then Reverend David, if you could briefly outline the current structure of your church, particularly in...
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, Tim, can I just check? I'm just looking at, I just want to correct or just get on the record. The Diocese of Melbourne was founded in 1847.
That's right.
And Ballarat was 1875. Yep.
Yes.
And the others, Bendigo, Wangaratta and Gippsland were 1902.
That's correct.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Just while we jump in, can I go back to Archbishop Peter? Great to get clarity on the numbers around how many of our people are identifying with the Catholic Church. But I'd like to ask you a question. You talk for a small portion of the Catholic Church. Have you sought authority to speak on behalf of the Catholic Church more broadly?
I have spoken, Commissioner, to the other three bishops here in Victoria, but I have not spoken with a more broad reality. We meet, in fact, I will travel to Sydney tonight when we will begin a meeting of all the bishops in Australia.
You see that as an issue coming here today, given the significance of the role of churches, but just more broadly about, how important this process is?
Yes, there's certainly an awareness amongst the other bishops in Australia that I will be here today, but I stand as in my own jurisdiction, so it's not perhaps different to other Christian denominations. We have a fairly flat level of governance, so I'm responsible for this area, and while we speak as bishops in common regularly, and I draw your attention to last year's, or in fact this year's, it leads into this year's annual social justice statement, which was very specifically on Indigenous matters, and we do that on a regular basis.
Thank you, Commissioner. Love it. So I was going to go to Reverend David to allow him to briefly outline the structure of the Uniting Church in Victoria.
Thank you, Council. So the Uniting Church in Victoria has approximately 500 congregations. The congregations are organised into 7 presbyteries. Presbyteries in a similar sort of structure. The majority of members of presbytery are appointed by those congregations. The 7 presbyteries plus the Presbytery of Tasmania join together to form the Synod of Victoria and Tasmania. So in a similar way, representatives from each of the presbyteries form the majority of the membership of the Synod. The Synod is one of, I think it's 6 synods in Australia, and nationally we have an assembly. So the assembly body has responsibility for doctrine and some of the other broader issues across the church. Synod has responsibility across its region, and each of those elements, the presbytery and the congregation, have particular responsibilities for their own patches. We also have some other agencies as well with whom we have relationships, but I think that's the broad structure that you're asking about.
And the Uniting Church has a unique history. My understanding is that it was formed in 1977 upon the union of Presbyterian, Methodist and Congregational churches. Not all churches within those groups united, but for the large part, those churches came to form the union. Is that correct?
That's correct. All of the Methodist churches did. They came on block. The Congregational churches came in, and the majority of Presbyterian churches came in.
And so when we're speaking about historical matters today in relation to church presence in Victoria, for your part, it's often discussion about those particular churches that had various presences in Victoria throughout the course of the colonisation of the state.
Indeed, and in fact, if we go back to the early 19th century, we're talking about nearly a dozen different churches which gradually amalgamated into, say, the Methodist Union and the Presbyterian Union, which then amalgamated into, amalgamated's not quite the right term, but joined into the Uniting Church.
But it's clear that my understanding is basically because the churches have no legal personality. There's not an inheritance of the Uniting Church to legal succession in title of those churches, but nonetheless, as your submission, opening statement and presence today indicates, there is nonetheless an acknowledgement by the Uniting Church of the, if I can put it this way, responsibility for and ownership of the history of those churches in Victoria.
Yes, indeed.
I just wanted to give an opportunity to each of you to also describe for the commissioners what Aboriginal-led ministries or structures exist in your church in Victoria today, and just to share the space. I'll allow Archbishop Peter to start if I can.
Thanks very much. And commissioners, I might respond to this question naming specific initiatives and works and ministries that exist, and then a broader description, if that's okay. So in the Archdiocese of Melbourne, or in fact over the whole of Victoria, we have the Aboriginal Catholic Ministry, which has been established in 1988. If my date is right, you have the correct information in our submission. And that's been in continuous operation and into the future, funded by initially by the Archdiocese of Melbourne, and then now the 4 dioceses in Victoria. There is also the Opening the Doors Foundation. The Opening Doors Foundation is a foundation which was established in the early 2000s to assist in the support of any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander child in a non-government school in Victoria. So any amount of grants annually are offered to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander child who indicates that they wish for a grant. So that's another ongoing reality. The BINAP Partners is a group of non-Indigenous persons who work with and support Indigenous peoples, no matter what, whether religious or not, just in terms of their indigeneity. There are fire carriers in all of our schools. Fire carriers are those who, in a program and in a way in which in each of our Catholic schools there is a nominated person. In nearly all of those schools, that is an Indigenous person themselves. There'd be perhaps only 1 or 2 schools that may not have an Indigenous student at the moment, or a teacher. And it is generally a way of bringing the fire into the life of the school in terms of reconciliation and building acknowledgement and respect and recognition.
Excuse me, Archbishop.
Yeah, sure.
That fire carrier a student or an adult?
Usually a student, but not always. So in a couple of examples where there is not yet or at this present time, not an Indigenous student in a school, say it might be a very small school in rural Victoria or something, that then it would be someone who is nominated. It is done, the choosing of the person is via the Catholic Aboriginal Ministry.
And what are their obligations?
To awareness raising, to build relationships, to seek pathways of reconciliation.
On the Aboriginal student to do that?
Yeah. And speaking directly into the life of the school itself. In our safeguarding environment, we have a cultural competency for all Catholics in employment or in ministry, including myself, which helps to develop culturally safe environments for Indigenous peoples, particularly children and young people. We have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Action Plan, which is across the state. That plan is held by the Victorian Catholic Education Authority. It's a new acronym, the VCEA. It was until a few months ago the Catholic Education Commission of Victoria. So you may have heard of the CECV. It's changed name recently and now it's the VCEA. There's an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Sunday celebrations and resources every year. So in the cathedral, St Patrick's Cathedral in East Melbourne, not far from here, we celebrate the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Sunday with a significant Indigenous expression of our worship, our liturgical worship. There is a particular, it's called a mass setting. How can I describe this? Certain parts of our Catholic liturgy are set things that are sung. And there is a particular mass that's been commissioned that is an Indigenous composed mass, drawings fairly strongly on more northern Indigenous traditions, musically coming particularly out of the Tiwi Islands. We have probably an obvious things. We would have Indigenous flags in the cathedral, for instance, at our schools and in parishes, and in the cathedral. Once again, I'm just trying to describe things in our cathedral at the moment. If anyone's had an opportunity, if you walk into the forecourt, there is a very major Indigenous floor plan, and in each of our churches there will be a message stick. The message stick is important. You'll find this in each of our parishes and our schools, and it carries the message of Indigenous people to those locations. It is displayed prominently and available there for people. I would then just draw your attention to the more general things. Those are the specifics that I wanted to share with you. The more general is that there are action plans in education, in our schools, in our welfare services. There is a very significant amount of, while not targeted programs, but programs that are open and available for Indigenous or Torres Strait Islanders, particularly in the area of social services. A lot of ministry within the prisons, which we're involved with, and our Catholic healthcare agencies. While I can't speak specifically about them because I don't have jurisdiction there, there are also action plans and significant ways in which services of aged and health care and disability care are extended into Indigenous populations.
I ask us, Bishop, you articulated a lot of things there. You touched upon cultural competency. My question to you is, do you see yourself as culturally competent?
That's a good question. I would hope I am. I don't think I would want to go so far as just make a blanket. I am. I've certainly done training in that, prepared by the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Catholic Council. So there's a national body, and they provide training, and I have undertaken that. But I wouldn't hope that is the case. It's for others to judge about me.
I second that question, Archbishop. We were talking about fire carriers a little bit earlier. We talked about students undertaking that role. Now, as a proud Karatmara Gunijmara man, the cultural load on that child to carry that fire stick or the fire is a massive cultural load for that child to do. So just want to make the point of, I wouldn't articulate that if that's our measure of success, that that's cultural competency in the context of my people. Just wanted to make that point. I think it's really important that we should be looking after our young people and not overloading them with cultural loads and the continual compounding thing where they have to educate non-Aboriginal people on our history, our journey, and the things that have continually happened to us as well. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks very much. Might I just, the manner in which people are chosen comes from our Indigenous peoples in the offices of the Catholic Aboriginal Ministry, and I would certainly be happy to take that back to them.
Yeah, I understand that, and I think they're fitting in your structures. But again, when we think about our culture, our practices, that is a significant load that our people are carrying in society and continue to carry, recognised also by your earlier acknowledgements here as well around our people and what we've been through. So just, it's really important that we don't lose sight of that. And cultural competency is something that has to be continually strived for. And it's really hard to achieve that because it needs continual effort as well.
No, just on the back of that, you mentioned cultural safety. What does that look like within the Catholic Church?
We have specific policies that have been developed in terms of training in every entity within the Archdiocese that I'm responsible for. So particularly if I can go to parishes, might be a good example of this. So that there is training done every year in safety and safeguarding that targets and specifies certain vulnerable people within our society, and part of that is through the Commission for Children and Young People competency programs that enable people to identify and allow people to say, I'm of an Indigenous heritage, whether it's Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, that they might be acknowledged within the context of their local community.
How do you make it safe enough that they can identify? If they want to be in, that's of course their choice, whichever.
Various things. I'll describe one parish that I was in 2 weeks ago, where they've set up a particular zone within the church building itself, which provides also a place of safety for individuals. It wouldn't be specifically for Indigenous, just as it wouldn't be specifically for other particular grouping of children, but that's an example.
Given the history with the Catholic Church and First Peoples in this country, how do you make that space culturally safe? I'm not really, how do you make it culturally safe? I'm just not, what is, other than that, what are the practical examples?
Right. So there's been a commitment for the Church throughout Australia to certain actions in regards to how we actually are present within the life of Indigenous peoples. Would it be helpful if I read those to you as the commitments that have been taken on?
Look, I love a good commitment, but unless those actions are in place.
They are actions that are either in place or are moving towards being put in place.
I'm sure we can get that document and have a look.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's known as, we had a major gathering of the Australian Catholic Church in 2022 called a plenary council, and decisions were made there that are binding on everyone.
What happens if someone doesn't stick to those actions?
There is these are not civil decisions.
You know, I'm not trying to catch you out at all. This isn't a catch out. It's just we've heard a lot from government about actions. We've heard a lot of people on the stand about actions and commitment, but there's actually no accountability if these aren't adhered to. So I'm just wondering, what is the
The
accountability?
accountability is in the context of the Archdiocese of Melbourne comes back and lands on me.
And so what
quite
does that look
explicitly.
like if somebody feels or has been, just for example, someone's been racist against an Aboriginal person and that come back to you? I mean, it's just
If it does come back to me, I may not hear of that, but we have, many hundreds of priests and religious and so on who are in ministry. So if something comes to my attention, like anything, there'll be a risk assessment and understanding of what has happened, and if there is need to speak to the persons involved, then that will happen. We have structures within our archdiocese to enable that to happen. If there is not adjustments made, then further in terms of actions that might be taken.
thank you.
I've just got one tiny question. You've talked about the Sunday celebration and that the church has got sort of lots of First Peoples messages and things there, but you said it was mostly northern inspired. I was wondering why not Victoria.
No, we that was the musical modal structures came from there, just for this setting of, it's a particular setting of music. There's any amount of other musical dimensions. I just mentioned is one kind of feature which is celebrated within our normal Sunday masses.
Thank you, Commissioners. I might then just turn to Bishops Richard and Genevieve, and if someone can just briefly outline the work of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglican Council.
Yes, so the National Anglican Torres Strait Islander Council is a network, and it's supported by each of the dioceses that make up the General Synod, and its membership is of individuals and made who are Indigenous, and they form that council. The submission outlines its role in terms of providing pastoral care, and it also assists, encourages and resources Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ministries which exist in many dioceses. And I think I'd also want to highlight that it is part of the Anglican Indigenous Network, which has a seat on the United Nations. So NATSIAC doesn't, but the Anglican Indigenous Network does. In terms of what the submissions also refers to, the establishment of a provincial Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Council, that is seen as something, I want to acknowledge that it is at the beginning of its life, but that it's actually intended to be part of supporting the work of NATSIAC rather than separate to it.
And if I might just add to that, I think it might be salient that the key principles of that provincial pilot program are the recognition of sovereignty, the reception of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander generosity within our churches, the formation of a permanently funded representative body with an endowment of $3.5 million. That's the aspiration, and self-determination in decision-making and ministry, and full participation in diocesan, provincial and national church life, a kind of vertically integrated integration and participation in all aspects of the church's structure. And one of its particular goals is to help lead the General Synod at its next meeting in 2026 towards constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples in the Anglican Church of Australia Constitution, which is something that General Synod's been working towards since 2016. So that's a particular kind of focus of its work over the next few years.
Does it require a double majority of the vote of the
Yes, the complexities of how General Synod works would take us all day to work our way through, but we're confident.
And no doubt of constitutional change, as we all know.
We're confident that will progress in 2026.
Thank you. Reverend David, if you could just outline briefly the work of the Uniting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christian Congress.
Certainly, yes. The Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress came together in the mid-1980s and originally drew together Christian First Peoples members of the Uniting Church, but also some wider Christian input as well. The UAICC nationally invited the Uniting Church then to actually form a covenant relationship with them, which we did, as I've mentioned earlier. The UAICC is structured such that there are different regions, roughly corresponding with the synods. So there's a Congress Victoria and a Congress Tasmania with whom I have interactions. The membership of Congress, it's probably worth saying, is that all First people who are members of the Uniting Church are automatically members of Congress. But Congress is ultimately in control of its membership and may have other members as well. And I guess one of the ways that I work with Congress is through working together in Covenant Committee, which I co-chair with. The other co-chair is decided between, because we're a synod of Victoria and Tasmania, the other co-chair is decided between Congress Victoria and Congress Tasmania, and currently is actually Alison Overeem, who's a Palawa woman from Tasmania. So I work with Congress in that respect.
And the commissioners have, a number of the commissioners have visited Narana Creations, which is a 2NU submission, and the commission held a roundtable with the Wadawurrung at that location. Could you just briefly explain the background to that organisation to the commissioners?
Yes. Narana Creations was it has actually had a varied life in some ways. It was set up to provide for cultural education and promotion, and by the Congress. It has also at various stages been involved in various justice efforts, some of which are described in our submission. I'm not sure what else I could say towards that, but certainly they've been involved in various ways, and that will do for now.
Can I just ask? So,
Yes.
is there any partnership with First Peoples around Narara Creation, or is it wholly owned by the Uniting Church?
It's Congress has responsibility for it. So in the same way that, so in the Uniting Church, all property is held under trust by the Property Trust of Victoria or the Property Trust in Tasmania, but within the Uniting Church, we assign responsibility to different congregations in the main. But the Congress also has responsible body status for such things as Narana Creations, and they have their own budget, they have their own responsibilities in terms of how they look after that.
The Congress is still part of the Uniting Church.
The answer is yes, and it is technically part of the Uniting Church in the sense that the Property Trust has that ultimate responsibility, and yet they the Congress also sees itself as independent to the extent that we have a covenant relationship with the Congress.
I'm a little query on that. When I was there at that meeting, and the room we held our meeting was absolutely full of artefacts, First Peoples artefacts.
Yes.
And I just wondered what was going to happen with those. Are they being repatriated or?
I would not be able to. I'd have to take that on notice. I'm happy to take that on notice, but I can't give you a direct answer on that.
And to Commissioner Walter's question, I note that the submission states that the Victorian Congress Oversight Committee, who looks after the venue, has engaged with the traditional owners to explore possibilities for the future of the organisation.
Yes, indeed.
And so it might be that might be a topic of conversation.
Indeed.
So I just want to turn now to the centrality of country for Victorian traditional owners. In the Gove land rights case in the 1970s regarding the Gove Peninsula in the Northern Territory, Justice Blackburn stated that the fundamental truth about the Aboriginals' relationship to the land is that whatever else it is a religious relationship. There is an unquestioned scheme of things in which the spirit ancestors, the people of the clan, particular land, and everything that exists on it are organic parts of one indissoluble whole. Now, while of course it cannot be universalised as a statement necessarily for all traditional owner groups, nonetheless, it's been relied upon in a number of cases to generally describe traditional owner relationship to country. I just wanted to ask each of you, when you hear the Aboriginal relationship to land described as a religious one, as representatives of various churches, what does that evoke for each of you? And I might start with you, Archbishop Peter.
The statement from the heart names sovereignty as a spiritual reality. And most definitely that is. The sense that land, as distinct from history, as distinct from other political conceptions, but land not just in a physical kind of reality, does speak very powerfully to this sense of the spiritual and religious dimensions that I've always experienced as being a part of the identification that people of an Indigenous identity speak to me. The finding of the ways in which that is then given expression varies in different amongst different peoples, and some of those might be spoken into more broadly into our society, but needing to know the particularities of the reality as it applies to here or here or here.
Anybody else want to react to that as well?
Thank you. Yeah, the statement that you read, I think, resonates deeply with us. I'm certainly no expert in this area, but we are, all of us, I trust, on a journey of learning and listening. I was reminded by Auntie Phyllis, who I referenced in that opening statement at Lake Tyers Aboriginal Trust just last month. She said, it's not just that country belongs to us, we belong to country. And hopefully a deepening understanding of these things is starting to be reflected in the specific ways that traditional owners are being acknowledged in services and meetings and events in our parishes and schools and agencies. Specifically, I think, around the rights and responsibility of elders to care for country, which really has such primacy. The network of kinship and law and language, as I understand it, ceremony is all connected around the notion of country, where the creator ancestors live and continue to guide through land and waterways and animals and plants. So it's this sense, as you referenced, that everything has this spiritual dimension. And I guess the challenge for us sometimes is that can be very different from a kind of Western understanding of the dichotomy between the secular and the sacred, or the spiritual and the material. It's a much more organic whole. And I was really helped in this by a very brief statement by Trululaway theologian Gary Deverell, who says, for us, spirituality is all about the most basic building blocks of life: country, kin, and the practice of a ritual storytelling that weaves past, present, and future living together in a web sometimes referred to as the dreaming. So I think that kind of resonates with the statement that you read earlier.
And Reverend David, did you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you. I certainly completely agree that the sense of First Peoples' spiritual connection to country is undeniable, and we would not want to deny that at all. It may be of interest to the Commission to know that in February, the School of Indigenous Studies, which is a part of the University of Divinity, ran a conference here in Box Hill about Indigenous theology and Indigenous justice. And so this was very much First Peoples-led conference. And I think it was a very significant conference in that it brought together a range of First Peoples views on how Christian theology and Indigenous spirituality connect or don't connect. There are a range of views. And I think the conversation between that range of views was a particularly important part of the conference. And in some ways, I recognise that this is a conversation which occurs amongst First Peoples. It's not for me to say how that lands, but I would say that the churches have a strong interest in learning from this and in learning from those conversations. So.
And given the strength of attachment that each of you have described, do each of you accept that traditional owner relationships to lands and waters is central to culture and beyond that, cultural survival?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Can I just add something personal, Mr. Goodwin?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes.
I just wanted to say, Commissioners, for me personally, in terms of my own learning, I think where some of that has been helped for me is with one of our canons, Glenn Lockery, the Reverend Canon Glenn Lockery. And I'm thinking particularly of a recent book that he wrote, and just reading it because he actually grew up in one of the areas that I served as a Anglican priest. And seeing his journey or reading his journey in what it meant for him in terms of land and his Christian faith and even just in terms of his journey of his own Aboriginality and what that meant in terms of reflecting on his where he grew up and the land and in his experiences. So I suppose I just wanted to add that's where that's the sort of thing that's been part of my learning journey, but I want to emphasise it's a learning journey in that.
Those acknowledgements and understanding has not always been the case in the history of the churches here in Victoria. If I can just mention first, and particularly I'll ask Archbishop Peter a question arising out of this. A number of 15th century papal bulls or decrees legitimised the colonial era seizure of Indigenous lands, particularly in the Americas, leading to the coining of the term the doctrine of discovery. In short, the doctrine asserted that lands uninhabited by Christians could be discovered and colonised without due regard to the rights of Indigenous peoples. Last year, the Vatican officially repudiated the doctrine of discovery and stated that the papal bulls did not adequately reflect the equal dignity and rights of Indigenous peoples and have never been considered expressions of the Catholic faith Do you agree with that repudiation? And if so, why was it important?
This came out of, the commissioners may be aware of enormous difficulties experienced by the Indigenous peoples within the North American, particularly Canadian dimensions, and a call for Pope Francis, the Holy Father, to visit Canada, which he did at that time. And the document itself comes from one of the, perhaps the easiest way of describing that department. It's called a dicastery, a department of the Holy See of the Vatican, and it's an expression of a naming of this so-called doctrine of discovery, and how that came about, and how that has, in different contexts, seriously undermined and gone to great harm of peoples, Indigenous peoples throughout the world. Those documents relate a lot to the time of the colonizations of the Americas, but have played out in other parts of the world as well. The document, I thought, was very clear in being able to articulate the reasons why this so-called doctrine was a false reality, and indeed a very damaging reality, naming, though, that it was never specifically a teaching of the Church, but had been caught up in individual statements made by the Pope at the time in regards to then political realities that were happening. So the history of these sorts of things play out also at a political level. Our situation here in Australia is an interesting one in this regard, I think, in that at the time of the colonisation of Australia, it certainly wasn't something that had anything much to do with the Catholic Church at all. In fact, the initial Catholics who came to Australia were convicts and had no part to play in those sort of societal and institutional decisions that were being made by a foreign entity. So that comes out of the particular British history that was not part of the Catholic tradition. So it's interesting to, I think, consider how this doctrine has spread into other kind of realities. So it may have had its naming in a Catholic setting, but it certainly moved well and truly beyond that reality and into ways of governments and states and taking on essentially a political thing. That the statement was made is very, very good. That it's made so definitively is really important.
And it's clearly an acknowledgement of the responsibility, at least from the Pope, of the Catholic Church's laying of part of the foundation that led to justify the dispossession of Indigenous peoples around the world through colonisation.
I would say that there were ways in which the words of the Pope at the time were taken up and interpreted was significantly problematic. So, a nation, or at least a state like Portugal or France, who were essentially the ones who were going to colonise the Americas, would take those words and reinterpret them. And I think that's important to acknowledge today too.
But given the attitudes of the time and the relationship between church and state at that time, I presume that the persons issuing those papal bulls knew to some extent how they would be used by those colonial states?
I think that's kind of from my perspective here now, I'd not be able to answer that question at all.
A number of academics, including First Nations academics such as Professor Mick Dodson and Professor Larissa Brent, have linked the doctrine of discovery to the concept of terra nullius in Australia. And I think Bishop Richard, you mentioned in your statement the repugnancy of the doctrine of discovery. Given the legal fiction of terra nullius as confirmed in the Mabo decision, what's the basis upon which you say the doctrine of discovery is repugnant, and what sense of responsibility, I suppose, for your church do you, by mentioning that, recognise?
Yes, just in terms of something Archbishop mentioned about the way that this kind of set of concepts has the capacity to kind of spill outside of its historical originating context, into academia, into popular culture. I noted that it's referenced in Ziggy Ramos's very powerful version of Paul Kelly's Little Things, for example. And I think as a pre-Reformation piece historically, we all have a stake in this and concerns around it. I think it is an example, I suppose, of the sense of entitlement or cultural superiority, which was drawn upon by colonial powers, in which churches were complicit, to legitimate conquest and other means of dispossession. Whatever its originating context and its status within the church as an organisation, it was something that was, derivable from church teaching, official or otherwise, and in the face of which the church was passive at best. And so there is that sense that this, I suppose, forms part of the backdrop of that colonialising worldview, which was brought to the colony of Victoria, including by the churches. So it is part of our kind of collective history. And personally, I think we've really welcomed the Vatican's formal repudiation of that doctrine in the statement of the dicasteries.
Reverend David, did you want to add anything to those comments? I saw you nodding at certain points.
Certainly nodding in agreement with those comments. I think I haven't been able to locate any formal resolutions by the Uniting Church Prayer Assembly regarding the doctrine of discovery, but we absolutely agree about its repugnancy, and certainly we have resolutions that have repudiated the notion of terra nullius and certainly worked towards land rights. So that's all I could add.
Commissioners, I note the time. Is that a convenient point to take a 15-minute morning tea break?
Mr. Goodwin, before we do that, can I just, as has been my habit, interrupt the piece of these breaks to foreshadow a question which I'd like responses to by all panel members in due course at a convenient time. I think everyone here and our letters patent, which established the commission, acknowledge the past of injustice, and I don't need to go over all that with you. It is, of course, one of the things that we need to consider and report on to establish a public record of those past injustices to Indigenous people. We're also charged with working out what to do about it. And it is no coincidence that the churches are here because you all reflect the conscience of our society. Therefore, injustice in the society is obviously something that you will be concerned with. And indeed, the activities of the churches are directed to matters of injustice. We have the very difficult job of trying to, if you like, make some effort to untangle the colonial mess. And that involves not just acknowledging past injustices, but actually doing something, suggesting what can practically be done. Now, your organisations are large, influential, and have the capacity to do things. And I'm wondering whether you can give us some indications of some ideas that might assist us in coming to a decision about the sorts of things that your institutions might do to contribute to addressing those injustices. I know it's a big subject, and I guess you'd have some notice of it by reading our letters patent, but it is a very hard thing for us to resolve, and the more help we can get, the better. So I put that on the agenda. At some point later on, you might each come back and tell me your budgets. Yes, thank you, Mr. Goodwin.
Yes, so shall we adjourn until midday then? Midday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to go, Council. Sitting has now resumed.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panelists for agreeing to stay on until 1:30. We'll adjourn at that point, Chair. But I note if you've got to make a speedy getaway at 1:30, so that will be no disrespect to the panelists if the Chair has to duck out immediately. I want to turn now to the process of how colonisation unfolded in Victoria. I just want to go first to a select committee of the United Kingdom Parliament report, which was established to inquire into Aboriginal peoples across the colonies in 1837. So we can first go to page 10 of that report, and if you'll see it on the screen. So this is a general select committee that was established regarding the Aboriginal tribes in all British settlements. So it covered the Americas, South Africa, other places in Africa, islands in the Pacific, New Zealand, and what was then termed New Holland, Australia. And the select committee noted that the inhabitants of New Holland in their original condition have been described by travellers as the most degraded of the human race, but it is to be feared that intercourse with Europeans has cast over their original debasement a yet deeper shade of wretchedness. These people, unoffending as they were towards us, have, as might be expected, suffered in an aggravated degree from the planting amongst them of our penal settlements. In the formation of these settlements, it does not appear that the territorial rights of the natives were considered, and very little care has since been taken to protect them from the violence or the contamination of the dregs of our countrymen. The effects have consequently been dreadful beyond example, both in the diminution of their numbers and in their demoralisation. So this is parliamentarians in the United Kingdom Parliament making findings in regards to those issues. If I can then go to page 59, and this is a general statement regarding, so not specific to Australia, but a general statement in relation to European colonisation under the heading Effects of Fair Dealing Combined with Christian Instruction on Aborigines. So the committee said, in the foregoing survey, we have seen the desolating effects of the association of unprincipled Europeans with nations in a ruder state. There remains a more gratifying subject to which we have now to direct our attention, the effect of fair dealing and of Christian instruction upon heathens. The instances are unhappily less numerous than those of an opposite character, but they are no less conclusive. And in reviewing the evidence before us, we find proof that every tribe of mankind is accessible to this remedial process, and that it has actually been partially applied and its benefits experienced in every quarter of the world, so that the main feature of the case before us being the ravages caused by Europeans, enough has been incidentally disclosed to show that those nations which have been exposed to our contamination might, during the same period, have been led forward to religion and civilization. Independently of the obligations of conscience to impart the blessings we enjoy, we've had abundant proof that it is greatly for our advantage to have dealings with civilized men rather than barbarians. Savages are dangerous neighbours and unprofitable customers, and if they remain as degraded denizens of our colonies, they become a burden upon the state. Just to put that in context, a number of historians and anthropologists explained to the commissioners that at around the time of this report, there was an evangelical movement that had taken government in the United Kingdom, and so there was a deep concern about the what were seen as unchristian acts of settlers, but a desire to protect through Christianisation of Aboriginal populations. But nonetheless, I think you'd all agree some of the language used is particularly repugnant in relation to Aboriginal populations. And I just wanted to allow you each to reflect on that genesis story, I suppose, if I put it one way, around colonisation in Australia. And given that that report was just as the first land grabs were occurring in Victoria, but as representatives of your churches, what your reactions are to that attitude at the time of Christianising those populations. I might just start with you, Bishop Richard.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, to the attitude that's abhorrent, the language that's expressed in is absolutely reprehensible, and we would resile totally from that, of course. I think it's interesting that there's this kind of nexus, this coming together of a sort of protectionist ideology, such as reflected in that other documents, and the kind of missionary evangelical zeal of some of the missionary societies, and the desire to promote the gospel. So there's sort of this nexus between church and state almost, and that 1836 Select Committee report is, of course, echoed in the colony of Victoria, where perhaps in response to the devastating census results of 1857, which show an 85% decrease in First Nations population over a 23-year period in the Port Phillip region. There's a kind of, in some quarters, an outcry reflected in the Argus newspaper, for example, and Thomas Macrombie sets up a select committee which reports to the Legislative Council in January 1859, accusing the government of neglect of the Aboriginal population. And that leads to the formation of the Central Board, and then later the Protection Board and the Acts of 1869 and 1886, which perhaps we'll come to. But at the same time, you've got, the Church of England mission to the Aborigines, forming here in Melbourne. And so they're starting to send missionaries, because part of what that select committee recommended in its report to the government was that there be greater government intervention in terms of reserves for agriculture and mission work. So the churches kind of join in and start to send missionaries as part of this enterprise. I was deeply, the enterprise itself, I would want to say, is just fundamentally flawed. It's just built on completely erroneous premises. I was deeply moved by the testimony of Uncle Jim Berg and Uncle Robbie Thorpe at a hearing in late March. And, Jim Berg reflected on this irony of a kind of a combination of a protective ideology in terms of those reserves and missions, coexisting with this loss of identity and language and law and kinship in precisely in that context. So there's this sort of, protection going on at one level, and cultural genocide at another level, and these two things are kind of coexisting. So it's a really debilitating paradox, I think, for us to come to grips with. And there's no question that our church partnered with the colonial government to implement policies and practices that were and continue to be profoundly harmful to First Nations people in Victoria, partly in response to reports like this and the kind of evangelical opportunities that they extended to the churches, and that those policies were grounded in a deep-seated and pervasive racism from which our church is far from immune. And that's had a devastating impact on the Aboriginal population, physically and spiritually, including in Gippsland. Between the 1840 and 1850, some 15 to 20 massacres, the loss of up to 300 Aboriginal lives. And whatever else they were, the missions were places of confinement, culturally, temporally, geographically. They contributed to segregation, to forced relocation, to assimilation a little later on. And Professor Marcia Langton in that same hearing referred to this period as the start of a kind of coercive native administration. She was quoting from an article legislating Aboriginality, and she described how First Nation people effectively become wards of the state, with the board and the churches serving in loco parentis, setting up this kind of institutionalized culture. And, you know, whilst we might argue, as per Professor Reynolds' evidence, that there were, you know, better and worse experiences of missions, there's no escaping the fact that the system itself, following on from these kinds of reports, was irredeemably broken. That it's conceived on a premise that was fundamentally flawed, built on stolen land and what Henry Reynolds called the original sin of Australia's colonisation, namely a complete disregard for the rights of the Indigenous population and acting without consent. And so it's pretty hard to preach the gospel on stolen land.
Can I just ask, would you agree with, you talked about protective, but it's still based on superiority of Christianity and inferiority of culture and spiritual beliefs? Would you agree with that?
Thank you, Commissioner Hunter, for the question. Absolutely. I think it's a paternal culture, a paternal environment based on superiority of culture and a sense of responsibility to, you know, to preach the gospel into that context, completely ignorant of any pre-existent spirituality. So the protectionist desire is itself part of the problem. The assumption that it was our place to protect, and the fact that the protection was even necessary, partly due to the conflict of the frontier wars, but also because of exposure to disease and other things that the miners brought with the gold rush. The fact that that was even necessary really speaks to the underlying problem. But the paternalistic way in which that was kind of implemented is a further problem.
Sorry, Commissioner Lovett.
One witness has observed that the missions and reserves system marked the beginning of Aboriginal deaths in custody. Can I open up to any responses to that?
Regrettably, I can only agree with that. And hence my remark that whatever else they were or were intended to be, they were places of confinement, incarceration. I think Uncle Jim Bergs spoke of being a prisoner, a refugee on his own country. Uncle Robbie Thorpe spoke of protracted and ongoing genocide. These are very, very hard truths for us.
I just want to repeat that because my mic wasn't on. More than one witness has observed that the missions and reserve system marked the beginning of Aboriginal deaths in custody. In the context of racism, does your church now say that your religiosity beliefs are superior to ours?
Absolutely not.
How then do you accommodate that?
I guess it's partly by coming to terms with our past and telling the true history of our past, and being on that journey that we've spoken of learning and listening, really attending to the wisdom of Aboriginal culture and spirituality and relationship with country, and repenting of the past, but seeking to move forward in respectful partnership.
It's an important segue into the creation of missions and reserves in Victoria, and as you highlighted, Bishop Richard, in an attempt to offer so-called protection to Victorian traditional owners, many were moved following those various reports that you've referred to onto reserves and missions and off country. And I suppose you've already acknowledged that was essentially an act of dispossession of land for Aboriginal people. Would you agree with that?
Most definitely.
And I know that the the Anglican Church had particular missions that it either operated or were present at, as well as the predecessor churches of the Uniting Church. I just wanted to give you, Reverend David, an opportunity to respond or add to any of Bishop Richard's comments from your own perspective.
Thank you, Council. And can I start by saying that I recognise and agree with your characterisation of history. I acknowledge that, and that accords with my understanding. And I agree with all of Bishop Richard's remarks. I guess one part that I would reflect on is that early in the 19th century, in part of my tradition, so the Methodists, so we had the Buntingdale mission, which lasted for a bit under a decade. And I think that mission in many ways demonstrates all of the complexities that have been named. This one was earlier than the ones which were much more sponsored by government. This was some missionaries who came out of England to with the idea of providing a safe haven in the midst of all of the violence. And yes, that speaks precisely to the underlying problem is actually the violence and the lack of recognition, all of that. And another classic example of the lack of recognition at that time was that the mission was set up on the boundary of several countries, so that it was never going to work, even in the sense that the missionaries had intended. And this was one where I certainly agree with the remarks about the deaths in custody. The Buntingdale mission was a little more free flowing. I think was less kind of people weren't confined so much to the mission. People came and went, but it's entirely true that the impulse to share the gospel was completely entangled with the idea of the superiority of Western civilization and certain social structures. So it's entirely true that the missions were disastrous in that regard.
And in addition, you mentioned in terms of the missions being disastrous, not only in terms of the dispossession of land, but in various ways in terms of the incapacity to practice culture and speak language, in relation to the removal of children from the care of parents, in the relation to the consequences of what became known as the Half-Caste Act, where persons who were deemed to be half-castes were initially forced onto those missions, but then no longer allowed to live there from 1889 onwards. All of those things suggest that there were huge and devastating societal and cultural impacts on Aboriginal Victorians of the mission and reserve movement. Would you agree with that, Reverend David?
Yes, certainly. And I mean, some of my own growth and understanding of this is when I began as a minister in Frankston, which is on Boonwurrung country, and doing some research into some of the history of the Boonwurrung people, and realising that people had been pushed onto a reserve at Mordialloc, and then subsequently were pushed onto the reserve at Corundurk, and subsequently the horrendous results of the act to which you refer. Yes, recognising that is deeply affecting and distressing, and so everything we're saying about this is true and terrible.
Can I ask, sorry, identity. How important is you as individuals, your identity to you? How important is it?
Very
In
important.
your culture. And you all have culture, right?
Correct.
You have culture? You're speaking in your language today?
Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
English. Not one of you mob during your acknowledgements mentioned any word of language. Language is the heart of identity.
Mhm.
That has been taken away from our people. Really important. How many of our people get to walk around talking in language, practicing culture? You know, you're practicing your form of culture by the work that you do every single day. But our people don't have the ability to do that, haven't had the ability to do that. Forcibly put on your rations if you were caught sneakily teaching language, practicing culture, rations. So cut off rations, rations meaning not getting much at all, and then further cut from rations. How does that sit with you? You get to speak language every day. I've had to learn, try to learn and reclaim language myself. Like we see our children growing up in schools. Very rarely is our language taught, our history taught. But we can learn other people's languages, English, many other multicultural communities' language. Churches played a significant role in taking that right. That's a human right, but a cultural right away from us. I'd like to hear some responses to what I've just said then.
Commissioner Lovett, it's a terrible injustice, and it's one of the worst legacies of the mission, the whole mission enterprise. And as you've explained, reminded us, it's a way of disempowering people to take their language. And you know, one of the great stories of resilience, I think, that emerges through the horrible history that we're discussing now, is the capacity of First Nations people to recover language and retain language and to find ways of holding on to that and other aspects of culture. But it's an absolutely lamentable result of the church's involvement in some of these government policies.
And before I get the other responses, the churches knew what they were doing. This is targeted. They knew what they were doing. You attack culture and identity, in particular language. You start with that.
If I might just have one more comment to that very point. I think that the twin policies of segregation and assimilation both result in erasure, in disappearance, in different ways, but both, absolutely reprehensible.
Yes, I can only acknowledge all that you say and acknowledge that what you say is true. We recognise that our involvement in missions has very much contributed to that dispossession from language as well as culture and land. We do certainly recognise all that, yes.
I offer a word. Yes, can I offer a word at this point, which is something of a different story that might need to be able to be told truthfully. While I absolutely acknowledge that to strip language, language not only by way of spoken word, but language of gesture and action and custom and so on. The speaking that comes by way of acting has been a deeply damaging reality in the past of the history of Indigenous people here in our own country. The context in which you've posed this question to us in and around this discussion around missions and so on has not been a part of the story of the Catholic Church here. The Catholic Church wasn't involved in the missions.
Yeah, with respects, we as Aboriginal people and commissioners, we understand who had an involvement and who didn't. We've heard many a truths come before the commission here. Just with respects, I say this. This is truth telling, and I'm asking the questions of the people, particularly who represent organisations that forcibly undertook and knowingly undertook these practices, as Auntie Vicky Cousins refers to it as linguicide. So,
could you explain that word,
linguicide? I think it speaks for itself with authority.
Can I just add something to that? We go back to the doctrine of discovery before, how your answer to that, although you say you're not involved in the missions, and that the churches sort of have distanced themselves from it, but at the time you knew what was happening with the doctrine of discovery, but did you stop it? Churches stop it?
So I can only speak on behalf of the Catholic Church. In the context of our particular colonialisation, the thing of doctrine of discovery had shifted very much away from anything associated with the Catholic Church. Those who, speaking on behalf of our church, those who had leadership at the time.
Did they try to stop it?
Yes, could I quote directly from the Bishop of 1845?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this is Bishop Paulding, the first Catholic bishop in Australia. This goes back to a commission that was held in the New South Wales Legislative Council at the time, 1845, and he said this, so I'll just quote from him. He described the settlement of the colony as occupation by force, accompanied by murders. He put himself in the place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, saying, putting myself in that position of a Torres Strait Islander or an Aboriginal, and taking away all that I know except that this is my country, that my father lived by pursuing the emu and the kangaroo, and that I am driven away from my hunting grounds, and that my children and tribe are subjected to the grossest barbarities. What was shown up on the screen a little earlier, talking about barbarians, is just an enormously troubling reality that this was part of the language. But I want to sort of indicate here that that wasn't necessarily the language of the leaders of the Catholic Church at that time.
It happened across the doctrine of discovery has been used a lot, right? To take lands, and it's over a period of time, and now you distanced yourself from it. But at the time, when the Catholic Church was associated with it, did they stop it? That's probably the best way to put it, yes or no.
There was a whole sectarian question going on at this point where Catholics were disenfranchised as well in our society, which is part of it, another part of the history of this land.
Can I just ask another question of all of you? The churches are like sacred, okay, and protected. During that time, were our sacred sites protected? And are they still protected as much as the church is?
No, they weren't.
And are they still?
I think we're seeking to be more attentive and guided to learn about our responsibilities in that regard. We would think Bishop Geneva wouldn't presume to know, how, what, and where we can be most helpful in that space. But I think we're seeking wisdom in that regard. So.
Can I just take the opportunity to go back to your question, and I just want to voice my acknowledgement as well. I hadn't actually voiced that. I'm not going to expand much more, but I just wanted to actually verbally voice that and echo what Bishop Richard said, and also your further question in regard to knowledge and so on. So I just wanted to acknowledge that verbally, and I think again reiterate in terms of what you're asking about sacred sites. I think we can say confidently at the time there would have been a complete lack of awareness, or if there was any awareness, it wouldn't have been given much credence. In terms of now, I think I would be simply saying that is part of the journey that we're on. I don't think I can actually. I think I just want to say that it's a journey and awareness, and we're very aware much more now, I think, of being either in partnership or in consultation with the appropriate First Nations.
If I could just give you a very quick example further to that from Gippsland. So we're in respectful partnership with GLAWAC, Gunnerkurnai Land and Waters Aboriginal Corporation, around areas, in that part of Gippsland that are sensitive, that are sacred. And so having a direct relationship with the elders through that corporation is part of that journey that we're on, part of the way that we can be informed and inform ourselves about our responsibilities in that regard.
Sorry. Just that one little thing on the doctrine of discovery, and I know that it was in place for 500 years, and it was only repudiated in March last year. That's an awful long time to be in place and not to be revoked.
I just wanted to come back to the word partnership. Can you just explain briefly what you mean by being in partnership with GLAWAC? So the partnership, because partnership can be many different things. So I just want clarity on partnership, please.
Thanks, Commissioner Lovett. It's perhaps a clumsy word. It's without presumption. It's really about trying to build relationships, beginning with personal, direct relationships, with people like Grattan Mullet and other elders in the region who we're in regular contact with, so we can hear the stories and learn from them. So it's that kind of, with all due humility, trying to listen and learn from the local elders.
And when you listen and learn, how do you translate that through your everyday practices?
I guess we do that by trying to raise awareness. So part of my role is to try and do that through all of the different teaching and communications opportunities we have through the diocese, through our, diocesan, newspaper, and so we're constantly referring to these things, trying to build that teachable spirit, I guess, in the environments in which we work, and through our schools as well. That's a really important space for this kind of activity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners.
May I add a few notes?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you, Councillor.
Takes me a little while to find who's speaking.
Yes,
Sorry.
Could I add, Commissioners, since I spoke this morning, I said I had not been able to find a reference to our Assembly making comments about the doctrine of discovery. I have actually since been informed that the Assembly, our National Assembly, has indeed repudiated that, at a national level. Can I also comment that various missionaries in the name of the church have acted in different ways. There were some at some points who were there were certainly some who were worse. There were some who were perhaps a little better than others, such as John Green at Yoorrook, which I believe that the Commission has explored this previously, so we don't need to go over that again. I would also mention that whilst I am not aware of any mission in Victoria that that respected language, I am aware that in other parts of this land now called Australia, that there have been missionaries and churches who have actually worked to work in language and to learn language. I regret that I'm not aware of that being a part of the Victorian experience.
And I want to turn to that complicated nuance of history that you've just highlighted, Reverend David. I think everyone's agreed about the devastating impact of missions and reserves as an act. But you've highlighted in terms of the running of the missions, there's a complicated history. Professor Henry Reynolds gave some evidence on that very issue to the commissioners and said, so it's very difficult to put out a very single rule about what the missions were like. Some of them were indeed extremely punitive. They controlled everything, including marriages. They also punished the use of traditional languages. They frequently separated children from parents by setting up dormitories. All these things are very common, but there was a great variety of how punitive they were. Particularly the German missionaries from the very start had insisted that you have to learn the languages, and he's referring to Aboriginal languages there, and teach the gospel in the languages. So that experience has to be dealt with mission by mission. But overall, yes, there was a great deal of control, which they no doubt felt was in the interests of the First Nations, that they had to be treated like children for their own good. And your reference to Reverend Green is also an interesting one in terms of his evidence before the inquiry in 1881 into the circumstances at Corandurk. And he was asked, did you find them, the Aboriginal residents at Corandurk, good workers? Yes. You never had any reason to complain? No, never. How did you manage when they disobeyed? You can see the assumptions in certain questions. Reasoned with them? You would not call in the police? No, never. Did you ever have to punish the blacks? And I'm using the language of the day. No, I always treated them as free men and reasoned with them. I made a law with their own sanction and also fined some of them for drinking. But that was the Aboriginal law, that if any got drunk, they were fined. They were fined, and some of them were chastised according to their own law. Did you find them truthful as a rule? Very, and honest, How as a church do you grapple with the complicated nature of that history in terms of, no doubt, not allowing good acts to describe the ultimate consequence, but nonetheless grapple as a church with that complicated history? I know that's a big question, but I'm just, but so is every question involving religion. So I'm interested in your reflection on that.
I think in terms of how we grapple with that complexity, the best answer that I can give is through truth-telling opportunities, such as I've had with my own congregation in the past, and where we have needed to confront the history of the lands on which we've been located. The overall complexity remains difficult, and so we are reliant on our work with First Peoples, in particular for us, the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, in terms of how we can best unpack that and do what is best for where we are now.
Bishops Geneve and Richard a similar question, and by reference to an example that is before the Commission around Lake Tyers, and in particular the efforts of John Bulmer, and his close relationship with the people at Lake Tyers, to the extent that the government was essentially, when they took over the running of Lake Tyers, could not kick him out, even though they wanted to. And when he passed away, I think 4 years later, after the government had taken over the mission, his wife and daughter were going to be evicted, and a petition was written by Aboriginal residents at Lake Tyers asking for them to stay, for John Bulmer's widow and daughter to stay, which was refused by the board, and they were in fact evicted. Again, the same question, given that complicated nature of the history of these places, how have you, and particularly as Bishop of Gippsland, but Bishop Geneve, feel free to also contribute, how do you grapple with that complicated history?
Yeah, it's another paradox, isn't it, Tim? I've actually written about this in the current edition of our diocesan paper as a result of my kind of thinking about these questions, and it's true by all accounts, including those of local residents. John Bulmer, who was the Church of England lay manager of Lake Tyers for 47 years. He was only ordained in 1904, towards the end of his life, when Gippsland became a diocese. And by all accounts, he was a caring, decent, compassionate man. Relatively speaking, and I want to underscore relatively speaking, he encouraged traditional cultural practices and hunting. In fact, he settled on Lake Tyers, partly because of its proximity to some of those opportunities. During the period of so-called mission tourism of the 1870s and 80s, he encouraged a degree of economic independence for the residents of Lake Tyers through the selling of artefacts, something that the board explicitly discouraged. The National Portrait Gallery in Canberra refers to him as being unusual among his contemporaries for recognising the merits of Aboriginal customs and laws. And, you've referred to those two, in fact, petitions to the board, which were unsuccessful, to allow his widow and daughter to stay on the mission after he died in 1913. And they were headed, "Give to us the people we would love to have among us," which says something about the kind of paternal affection in which he was held. But again, I'd want to stress that paternal affection bespeaks the heart of the problem. So he might have been a good man doing his best, but the system in which he was working in was irredeemably broken. And so, how do you try and work for good in a system that's so fundamentally flawed and broken? And so, I've got just a very short excerpt of a 1962 poem by Kath Walker, from her Aboriginal Charter of Rights poem, which I just wondered if I could have leave to read, because I think it sums up some of this. She says, "Give us Christ, not crucifixion. Though baptized, blessed and Bibled, we are still tabooed and libelled. You devout salvation settlers, make us neighbours, not fringe dwellers. Make us mates, not poor relations, citizens, not serfs on stations." And I think that's the kind of, paradox that John Bulmer was operating in.
And I know the Catholic Church wasn't involved directly in terms of the operation of missions and reserves, but just in terms of reflecting on a similar theme around the paradoxes, as Bishop Treloar has mentioned, Bishop Richard, Archbishop Peter and Mr. O'Leary, the Fifth Plenary Council of Australia in July 2022 acknowledged that the Catholic Church, and I quote, "has been caught up in the history of dispossession, stolen generations, racism, and the undermining of language and culture, dioceses, eparchies, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that word, and religious institutes have made sincere efforts to share faith, education and pastoral services with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, much suffering has been inflicted by the historically misguided attempts of those who were ignorant of the cultural richness of these peoples. And I think your submission also highlights the Catholic Church's reaction to the Bringing Them Home report in relation to stolen generations. In terms of that complicated history, Uncle Brendan Kennedy, a tuddy elder, gave evidence before this commission. And in relation to his upbringing, he said, "I don't remember this, but my older siblings say that welfare tried to come and grab me and my little brother because we had fair skin. We were safe at school, the Catholic school, and that community kept us safe. The Catholic priest and nuns would come to our rescue from the welfare. They advocated for us. Our teachers were our godparents. My teacher's name is on my baptism certificate." So again, there's a complicated history in relation to these matters, and I presume you'd agree that that the acts don't cancel each other out, or things of that nature. But how do you, the same question, how do you, as a church, grapple with that complicated history?
Yes. There's been, the reason why I asked if I could quote from Bishop Paulding way back is that it gives something of the story of this, in a sense, two paths that have happened within the life of Indigenous people in relation to the Catholic Church. There's been the path of always dignifying and seeking to find ways of enabling the Indigenous people to flourish. I think of here as schooling has been a crucial part of that across the country since the early 1800s as a pattern around that. But they're also a bit like what I was going to say father, you're not father. I'm using the Catholic term, sorry. David made mention of there have been individuals and perhaps localised communities that have not followed that way in the history that is there, and that's where the apology comes out. This particular apology that I mentioned, and this is what I was referring to, commissioners, early in our earlier session this morning. This was on top of apologies that have been offered on various occasions in the past and actions taken in regards to it. Going to Commissioner North's question that he posed prior to our break, the Plenary Council, a national decision, a body of the church, put in place as part of what was acknowledged, also actions to be taken. So we might be able to talk about that when that part comes. But it's a two stories that have, one that is at times been terrible, another story that at times has been dignifying and working towards justice. So your naming of it as a very mixed reality, I think, is a fair point.
And despite that, would you accept that generally the Catholic Church and all, well, I'll put it to you on the basis of the Catholic Church, but not limited to the Catholic Church, but that the Catholic Church generally has benefited systemically from the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their lands?
I'm not sure if that's a story that can be told universally across the country. I think it's a different story in different parts of the country. And my experience, at least here in the Victorian context, that has there's very little land grant that was given, though there was some. And Tim might be able to speak more directly to this, and I'll pass over to him in a second. but that's not necessarily the story, say, in the Kimberleys or in far north Queensland or so on. That part of the story here is that the manner in which the church founded itself here had some significant play into the relationship of the Catholic Church with the state, and so that had some different experiences. The Education Act of the 1870s is a significant thing here, where the providing of schooling was significantly hampered because of the act itself. But there was ways in which then schooling was done by way of fundraising within local communities, and that led to purchasing of lands, for instance, across the state that have been used for mission ever since. Might I be able to pass over?
Yes, yeah.
I think certainly would accept that the Archdiocese has been the beneficiary of land and other support from governments, context of dispossession. I think that's right. I think, as you've indicated, the Church has made sincere efforts to translate those benefits into services for both Catholic First Peoples and non-Catholic First Peoples, for Catholics and non-Catholics. I think in our context particularly, there's been a massive investment in education. The great bulk, I think, of our assets, land and buildings, has come with no government support. So that's been built up, that patrimony has been built up over a long period of time.
Commissioners, I'm going to move into land issues that has just been raised by Mr. O'Leary. Were there any questions? I just wanted to provide an opportunity whether there were any further questions in relation to particularly the history of the state and the operation of reserves and missions before I move.
Yeah, can I just talk about the system that you worked in, said it was broken? I just want to make a comment. It was never broken. It worked it did what it intended to do, it did to First Peoples. This was as Mr. Love put out, this was no mistake of what it meant to do and the superiority of it. So let's be really clear. And we're getting this sanitised version, and I just want to point out the brutality of the history of First Peoples. It was brutal and it was swift, and the church has had a part in that, whether it's current history or current, and we need to recognise. And I just also wanted to point out for those in the room and those listening that have had these past effects, that if you in any way, shape or form, we've got 13 yarn to call, but I just feel like we're getting this sanitised version of genocide of First Peoples, not only genocides of people, of language, of culture, of land. And we're all sitting here talking like, yes, this happened, that happened, and we have the effects rippling through our communities today. And that is why we are in this room. And I just felt like it wasn't recognised. And I just want to honour those people that went through all those institutions, be it missions or institutions today, that are sitting here listening to this, that we recognise your pain and the brutality that you or your people before you went through. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hunter. I agree categorically with those comments, and I'm really helped by that correction, and will probably return to some of my earlier language in relation to the point you make. Thank you.
Yeah, did anybody else want to respond?
Just to acknowledge and to thank you, to indicate that you've probably heard something of the different stories amongst the churches as distinct from the church more broadly.
I think I would add that I think part of what goes on in trying to acknowledge the nuanced story is that the danger becomes that there's self-justification that goes on, and that can contaminate a truth-telling process. I use the word contaminate, but actually in another way, it's actually part of the journey of a truth-telling process that gets to the heart. So I just want to acknowledge that as well.
Thank you.
May I just make
Yes, of
one
course.
comment that in the covenant that the Uniting Church made with the UAICC, there was recognition, and certainly Pastor Bill Hollingworth made the remark in his response that in many ways, and I don't have the quote directly in front of me, but in many ways, we saw ourselves as smoothing the pillow for a dying race, and we acknowledge that to our shame that this was what was occurring, and was a reflection of the attitude at the time.
Thank you. So I just want to ask some questions around ownership of land. Mr. O'Leary, thank you for introducing the topic. Just before I ask some general questions, Mr. O'Leary, you'd accept that whether or not purchased or granted by government, ultimately any land held by the churches involved in some shape or form the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their land?
I suppose you would need to make distinction around, whether it was land obtained very early in the period, or are we talking about something, a recent purchase of land in the last 10 years? I think perhaps it's a bit more nuanced that all land is treated like that.
Well, I mean, from the original act of dispossession, I'm not seeking to put ascribe particular responsibility to particular acts of sale, purchase, or grant, but generally as a proposition that all dealings with land has as a necessary foundation, or all dealings in land that don't involve First Nations people, as a matter of first principle, must have involved possession of Aboriginal people from ownership of that land.
I certainly acknowledge the Archdiocese is part of that history of dispossession, and I also accept that we have been the beneficiary of land and others.
Thank you. So my understanding from the submissions is that each church holds land through property trusts established primarily for that purpose, if I've got that understanding correct. Yes. Although each of you has acknowledged that the records are poor in this regard, and I think the Catholic Church have already acknowledged that it's likely to have received grants of land from government, but likely to be small in nature, given the circumstances of the Catholic Church in the 19th century in Australia. But turning to each of the other churches, Reverend David, is it likely that the predecessor churches to the Uniting Church received grants of land for little or no consideration in the 19th century?
Yes, it is. Some of our predecessor churches refused such grants because they did not want to be beholden to the government, and they had a strong sense of that. But certainly, yes, I agree that some of our predecessor churches received land in that way.
And the same question to Bishops Geneve and Richard?
Yes, we did. The Anglican Church did. And that's listed in our submission in what we're aware of from our records.
And there, at least in the time that's been available to the churches, it's difficult to differentiate what current holdings might have been as a result of grants of land by government for little or no consideration, or at least less than market value, and other purchased land that might have been purchased on the market. I think I'm right, Bishop Geneve, by saying that it's difficult to unpick some of those distinctions.
I think what I would say is that we gave you to the best of ability what we could in the time frame. I think it's important to point out that there was sources of land over time come from Crown grants. This is my understanding, so stand correct. I'll have, if anything needs correcting from the diocesan office, please take that noted. But my understanding from both the submission and just from my knowledge of working there is in the diocese is that land comes from both Crown grants, purchases and also bequests. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as well in part of the fact that there were people as members of the Anglican Church who could actually, I suppose, be wealthy enough to make bequests. So I think that's important to acknowledge. And that what we tried to do for the Diocese of Melbourne was to give 2 snapshots in time, but we fully recognise that then that a fuller picture would be really to go through right to the present day and some form of reconciliation of that in terms of what the proportions were.
And just to put some figures on the table, so for the Anglican Church, to the best estimate that has been provided to the Commission, the property trust holds an estimated 260.05 hectares of land in Victoria, which is estimated to be worth approximately $1.49 billion. The Diocese of Melbourne itself holds $1.38 billion worth of that total, but acknowledges that value does not include the value of buildings and improvements on the land. In those circumstances, given that some of that value will be ascribed to grants of land by government, for little or no consideration, doesn't that in of itself highlight, well, I should go a step back. The information before the Commission is that under Native Title and Traditional Owner Settlement Act settlements, First Nations traditional owners, there would not be a First Nations traditional owner group that has such land and to that value. In those circumstances, doesn't that itself highlight a disparity in the treatment of churches and First Peoples, and particularly given the dispossession of First Peoples from their land as being a central core part of the story of this state?
Yes.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a shameful irony that at the same time as some of those policies we were speaking about a little earlier were being enacted, that there was a kind of colonial project of state aid to churches in the mid-1850s to 1870s until the Abolition Act came into force. And there's no question that there's a incredible disparity of land injustice, land justice outcomes between the Anglican Church and First Nations Victorians.
Just while we've been talking about the figures, I'll just jump in here and just recognise the transparency in which you've come to this process around being able to articulate the figures here. So just wanted to recognise that.
Reverend David, I'm not going to discuss the value or size of land holdings, but just generally as a proposition in terms of grants of land that you acknowledge are likely to have occurred to the church for little to no consideration. Again, the same question, doesn't that highlight a disparity in the treatment of churches and First Peoples that's particularly egregious in the circumstances of the dispossession of Aboriginal Victorians?
Yes, it does. Yes.
And I know that the Catholic Church is in a slightly unique position in relation to its property holdings, but nonetheless, in terms of any grants of land that might have occurred for little to no consideration, would the Church also accept that that highlights a disparity between the treatment of churches and First Peoples?
I think that disparity it certainly would accept that.
the State Aid to Religion Abolition Act was passed in 1871, and this is particularly relevant to the Uniting and Anglican churches, given the nature of some of the grants of their land. That Act provided that no further money would be set aside by the Victorian government for the advancement of the Christian religion, and that all lands previously granted to denominations by the Crown may be disposed of. It requires an application to government, as I understand it, to dispose of certain land set aside for religious purposes. A number of sales have occurred, no doubt, in the past 10 years, and the Anglican Church have provided a figure of 108 properties being sold in the past 10 years for sales of just less than $68 million. Has any of that money been set aside, acknowledging that there will again be a difference in terms of the grant of that land or purchase or the nature of that land, but has there been any setting aside of any monies for either traditional owners or Aboriginal Victorians more generally?
Could I speak in terms of the Diocese of Melbourne? I'm only aware of one thing, and it's not specifically the state of Victoria. So there was a sale of a property and the proceeds of that was very consciously contributed towards to help fund. I believe it's the national, not so much NATSEAC, but the appointment of an Aboriginal bishop. Now, I think if Archbishop Phillip was here, he'd be able to speak to that more confidently in the details because it precedes my time in Melbourne. But I am aware that that is actually one thing. In terms of other proceeds specifically from sale of property to then the money then going specifically to Indigenous either ministries or Indigenous corporations and so on, I think the answer is no. I'm not aware of anything. In the Diocese of Melbourne, I'm speaking of.
If I might just speak on behalf of the Diocese of Gippsland, we have a policy that from all land sales in the diocese, whatever their provenance, 1.5% is set aside for Aboriginal ministry. And by ministry here, alluding to the two Aboriginal priests I mentioned in my opening comments, I'm talking about more than religious activities. This includes outreach to the community through rites of passage, times of grief and crisis, material support, referrals, pastoral care, and school and agency governance. 1.5% is a woefully inadequate figure, and I want to acknowledge that, and I want to acknowledge that land injustice causes systemic disadvantage and legacy trauma.
And acknowledging that, is that 1.5% going to go up at all?
That's our hope. That's a sincere hope. It's just to clarify it a little bit, I don't want to over nuance this, but that is 1.5% of the 20% that the diocese retains from land sales. So it's a slightly larger fraction of that smaller pie, but our aspiration would be that number increases.
And what does that go to? Like, what's something it's gone to that you could?
That directly supports Aboriginal ministry in the diocese, which is funded entirely by the diocese through land sales, through grant applications, through individual donations, and as I mentioned earlier.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're also getting grants, and then that would mean that 1.5 is not enough. Like that would, or is that the grants out of the 1.5?
We fund any shortfall from reserves. So we are committed to supporting Auntie Phyllis and Kathy in their ministries in their communities, and so we fund that through that 1.5% of land sales, plus any other contributions that we receive. But we will fund any shortfall from our reserves.
If I went and asked them, would they say that was enough?
I hesitate to speak for them. We work very, very closely with them, and I'm in kind of weekly contact with them, and certainly if they have any needs over and above what we provide in terms of supporting their ministries, they are in touch, and we respond to those, at the time. We would love. We've just recently increased Kathy's fraction of engagement, and we would love to be able to continue that journey. And so, yes, we need to be contributing more, to that.
A lot of the, we'll use the word investment, seems to be back internally through how you've just articulated yourself there. And it's important to obviously do that, but we've heard and we've spoken a lot about the trauma and the taking away of culture, identity, practices, language. I'm trying to grapple in my mind around how come there hasn't been enough investment given the role of churches and on the missions to take that away, but the lack of investment to empower our traditional owner groups. And you talk about Gunai Kurnai around a partnership, which is, I knew we were going to get to this, is why I asked you the words about partnership a little bit earlier. But I'm grappling with how much investment, if any, how much investment is going back into traditional owner groups to strengthen their ability to invest in language, culture, and traditions. So we're hearing about land and the sales of land and the reinvestment there, but what about what's going out to our people to right the wrongs that you've articulated that has been wrong?
Thanks, Commissioner Lovett.
It's the same to also
Bishop
as well. Thank you as well.
Glad you've asked that question, because I can understand how what I've just described could be seen to be circular or self-serving. So that's why I tried to explain a little bit about what ministry means in our context, and so that Auntie Phyllis and Kathy really work outside the church structures in their communities, in their community groups, and they're deliberately, intentionally set free to do that.
Understand that. Yep. And I know that individuals, but again, the question is how much investment has gone from your organisation as a whole back to traditional owner groups to help them reclaim their culture, their identity, which the organisations that you represent knowingly and strategically took away from our people.
As I answered to Mr. Goodwin, as a diocese, from the sale of land, the answer is none to this point. I am aware of a parish in Melbourne who does actually include in its budget an amount given to the Wurundjeri Corporation, that very thinking that you're talking about. I want to emphasise I'm talking about one parish. I want to emphasise I'm talking about a very small part of their budget, but I just want to name that. The other thing I can only say, so in one sense I could just stop there and say that's the end. In the submission that we gave, we did, if you look through the sections that actually refer to synod motions and submissions that have been made, including from an Aboriginal council to a group at that stage to the provincial council, there was a definite mention of an amount to come from property to be invested, as you're talking about, or handed back in that sense. And that at the moment has not eventuated. Where we are up to as a diocese is looking at our strategy around property. We're aware both of wanting to be informed by the provincial Aboriginal and the pilot project, of which Bishop Richard spoke earlier, as well as what comes from the Yoorrook Justice Commission, because from when that was first proposed, it's since then that the Yoorrook Justice Commission was established, and that was proposed just pre-COVID. So, a couple of years before COVID. So, I'm saying it's a work in progress. It is very much there in the thinking of how does this as we move forward as a diocese, looking at our property strategy, which includes what happens in terms of sale of land, where does that thinking fit? I want to also openly acknowledge that within the church, there will be a debate, and this is where I think it's also important what comes from the Yoorrook Justice Commission recommendations to government and then how government acts in response. There will be a debate about whether should that support Aboriginal ministry, or should that support, as you're indicating, Aboriginal corporations and recognised leadership. So what comes from the Yoorrook Justice Commission to government, I think, will be important in helping to shape the debate and inform the consideration in the church leadership, is what I'm trying to say.
I mean, the investment internally could be further seen by the Aboriginal community as investing in yourself but protecting yourself. So I just, want to make that point. I think it's really important. And yes, we have had the ability to read all the statements that come before Yoorrook, but our community, don't have the ability and the time to be able to work through everyone's statements here as well. But I'd just like to give the opportunity to Reverend David, I think it was, to respond to my question.
And just to set up a factual foundation for the answer to that question as well, the Uniting Church, as we know from its submission, had a program of transfer of real property in the mid-1980s, and now also has a policy around provision of funds from sales since, in some shape or form, since 2011, with those funds going to the operation of Congress. So I just thought I'd quickly highlight that before you answer.
Thank you, Councillor, and yes, indeed, I was going to highlight those items as well. That certainly we did make some direct transfers of land in the 80s, and we do a proportion of sales proceeds in a similar sort of fashion goes to Congress, but our funding to Congress is topped up and not limited to that proportion of sales proceeds in a very similar sort of manner. I think to the heart of your question, though, we don't have an ongoing policy of transfer to traditional owners or working with traditional owners in that respect. So yes, we have to own that. We don't have that.
How does that sit with you? Just hearing what you've said today and shared. Pardon?
Yeah, uncomfortably.
Any other words?
Look, I think it is a matter that we need to address as a church, and I think as Bishop Geneve said, the recommendations and directions of this commission are going to be helpful to us as we navigate a way forward.
Can I just have a follow-on question? So many of the lands of the churches are on stolen lands, and the proceeds of selling these churches or these lands goes directly back to the churches. How does that sit with your Christian beliefs?
I offer something in that regard. Certainly from our perspective, it goes back into mission work, not into...
It goes back into your work and your values of your systems or your structures of churches. It is stolen land, and you collect the proceeds of that, and you have these beliefs and values. How do you grapple with that?
It goes to something like Catholic Aboriginal Ministry, which is run and operated and focused on Indigenous peoples, not only Catholic but non-Catholic, as an example.
So that's an example, but if you want to use that example, how much of those proceeds are going to them?
So we fund the full, both the location, the staff that are employed, the programs that are run, the ancillary aspects, something like Open the Door Foundation. So these funding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in any non-government school in the state, whether Catholic or not. So there's some examples. I went through them with you earlier on.
Yeah, and I guess we can't talk about the dollars of the estate of the Catholics, but to me, I don't think after hearing one, well, it wouldn't be a very huge amount.
It'd be very substantial though, yearly.
We can't talk about the dollars, then we can't say it's substantial, can we?
Commissioner, if I may, I think you ask actually a really interesting question and an important question, not just interesting in an academic sense. The part of the reality for us is that all of the assets that we hold are held in charitable trust, and so we have some responsibilities to act in accordance with the trust, so we have to ensure that whatever mechanisms we might find for transfers or the realisation of property in some way, it has to fit. For us in the legal sense, we have to abide by our obligations under the trust.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, but it is a white system on stolen land. So just putting that out there.
Not disputing that at all.
And just to follow on for that, the monies didn't put themselves in the trust themselves, did they?
Correct.
Mr. Goodwin, I have a few things to raise.
Perfect timing. I was going to turn to your homework.
Yes, thank you. Firstly, Archbishop, when a moment ago Commissioner Hunter described the situation as the land was stolen, I noticed that your expression, you winced as if I thought you were questioning whether that was a proper description of the situation. Do I get that wrong?
I think you got that very wrong. Sorry, but no, not at all. So whatever my face was doing at that time, I do not. It was not a rejection of what the Commissioner was putting forward.
So this really is very important. You accept, do you, that the land on which we meet and which is called Victoria was in fact stolen from the Indigenous people? It was illegally acquired. Not a difficult question. It's either right or it's wrong, and you responded to
sovereignty remains.
Sorry?
Sovereignty remains. And land is caught up in sovereignty.
Maybe you could expand on that.
So that the sovereignty was not ceded, that sovereignty is not just a matter of civil structure or so on, but that it goes to the actual identity and life of, including the land. We began, I think, a very first part of our conversation today was just how spiritually, that was it, I'm remembering now the word that was used, religious sense of the land. So that all remains in place, that sense of sovereignty. And so how then might the work be considered as to how that continues to be acknowledged, not only acknowledged by way of word, but by way of action, and how that might be worked towards systems of justice going forward, I think is going to be very much the work of the Commission to be able to make recommendations around that.
When you talk of sovereignty not being ceded, you speak about it as a concept coming from Indigenous people. I'm asking about what your concept of the land acquisition was, not what they say, but do you accept that the land was stolen?
I would accept that parts. I would accept that the concept of land generally it was a stolen. But I can't talk about that in terms of this parcel of land and this.
I'm not asking you about parcels. I'm
Yeah,
asking you whether
the land of
the territory of Victoria
Yeah.
was acquired illegally at the time of settlement. It's a very basic foundation
Yes.
of our whole inquiry.
And that has been already determined by us as a nation. We've said no to terra nullius. Good that we have said no to terra nullius.
Right. Second thing I'd like to observe is that the questions that have been asked, particularly of the Anglican Church, are based on submissions which are public. No questions have been asked of the other two churches by reference to figures of land ownership, because there is in place an application to keep those figures confidential, a matter which we have stood over for another day. But I wouldn't want those who are commenting on the evidence to focus on the forthcoming nature of the Anglican Church without at the same time understanding that the absence of questioning to the others is for a technical legal reason. And the third thing is, and I'm sorry it's come at the very end and we're limited in time, but I would like a response if you're able to concisely answer the questions I raised earlier on notice to you.
Could you reiterate the question? Because it's just, in one sense, there's been Mr. Goodwin's question, but if you could just reiterate the conciseness.
The question was really this, that we've heard an acceptance about and details of the injustice directed to Indigenous people. That's part of our remit to report on that, but very importantly for both the Indigenous citizens of Victoria and the non-Indigenous citizens, we need to know what you think about where to from here. You're all part of large organisations with capacity to assist society redress the wrongs, and you're here because you are the voice of the conscience of large parts of Victoria. Against that background, my question is, what are the positive steps that you say we should be recommending that your organisations undertake in response to the acknowledged injustices which you've described?
And just while I give you an opportunity to pause and reflect to answer that question, I should say Archbishop Peter had to leave at 1:30. So I'll leave to you if you have to, or you'd like to respond first.
If it's okay,
thank you.
Unfortunately, I better get on a plane, and they don't stay. So five things came out of the plenary council. You might remember I mentioned. I'll summarise them. You can read them, and I'm sure we can make this available to you. So these are recommendations that came to us from the National Catholic Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Council. So from amongst the Indigenous peoples of the Catholic Church, these are what they recommended to the Church in Australia, and which we have adopted. So just to say that. So I'm shortening them, yes, so they happen. So cross-cultural competency training and appropriate ministerial training, formation and into courses of cultural appropriation and retreat work, symbols and rituals that are appropriately used, and to enrich our own celebrations and to facilitate welcoming environment for Indigenous peoples. That our schools, parishes, organisations acknowledge in a prominent and appropriate manner the lands of the Indigenous peoples in which those places are located, and to always having an acknowledgement of that in meetings and at our celebrations. And finally, to unearth and discover the genius and the gifts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through inclusion in committees, boards, decisions-making bodies.
So there's no provision for a financial reparation scheme to address the question of land acquisition?
Not at this stage nationally. Yep.
Can I just say before you do take off, we're talking the Aboriginal community about unfinished business. Now, we've been able to cover and unpack quite a lot today, but there's still quite a lot of subject matters and areas that we haven't been able to get to due to time and you having to rush off. And I recognise that you have stayed on a bit longer than we initially anticipated, but if we are required to ask Use to come back at a later stage to further, I guess, the conversation, would Use be open to that? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for attending anyway, Archbishop.
And I do apologise to commissioners that I do.
Can I ask a quick yes or no question? It's really a yes or no, really. Do you support treaty or treaties for First Peoples in this state?
I think they should be examined, yes.
Thank you.
And I should note the submission says that too, Commissioner. Yes.
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Commissioner North, for your question. Picking up some of those things, the Uniting Church, first of all, let me say with respect to treaty, I think treaty is very important, and the Uniting Church, in fact, since 1981, I think, has been advocating for treaty, and I think ongoing advocacy by the church is certainly one thing that we can offer and will offer. In the same way that that we sought to advocate for voice, and we certainly support the truth work of this commission. And I think the ordering is important. This work of truth telling is going to inform the shape of treaty. So that's going to be helpful. I recognise that in terms of when making treaty, this needs to be First People led. And so in some ways I want to be cautious about what kind of formula or approach we should be wanting to take. But we're certainly open to the conversation. We're committed to the conversation.
You don't have a policy, an action statement that involves a scheme of reparation to address, for instance, land and water injustice of the past?
No, not beyond any of the actions that we've previously taken.
In terms of the Diocese of Melbourne, the answer is no, but the qualification to that is what I mentioned earlier around the property strategy being looked at, and that has been named as one of the considerations that needs to come into that. But I can't say that it's a determined policy at this stage. The other thing I would say in terms of the province is I think that it's important the role that we are establishing, that the council is being established, and the appointment of the Reverend Canon Glenn Lockery as an archdeacon in that role, and what the council is really hoping to achieve, and some important things around encouragement, the enlarging of numbers of Indigenous people in leadership in the church, both lay and ordained, and Bishop Richard referred to other things in terms of the ongoing sustaining nature of that. In terms of now, what's been put into that is the Diocese of Melbourne and the Diocese of Bendigo supporting the financially the appointment of the Archdeacon. So it is Bishop Richard said earlier what it's hoped to achieve as well, not just the council but the council informing our provincial council, that we can actually make that an ongoing sustainable trust or to sustain that work and so on. So, but I can't say that it's actually achieved yet, but I can say that all 5 dioceses have committed to that through the provincial council, and the 2 dioceses have taken the lead in terms of financially supporting that.
Mr. Goodwin, could I just pick up on something that Reverend David said in answering that question? I think I said earlier that it's hard to preach the gospel with integrity on stolen land, and I think this goes to the heart of our entire proclamation, and part of our responsibility as church leaders is to help our clergy and people grapple with the heart of the spiritual and material issues that are at stake in the questions we've been discussing today. I was mindful of Uncle Robbie Thorpe, when he expressed some reservations about coming before the Commission on the basis that he wouldn't expect to hear the truth from people and organisations that have done the damage. And I think one of our aspirations would be to shift that expectation and to be, as David said, to really deal with that truth-telling piece. We of all people ought to know that the truth will set us free. So I think that I just want to kind of echo what you said about that, David, as part of the process.
Thank you, Commissioners. I have no questions, further questions or any questions arising out of that. So
Just want to make a statement here. I'd just like to acknowledge in all our discussion today of the missions run by churches as places supposedly to protect First Peoples. They were the places where families were separated through the Half-Caste Act, and from which children were taken away, off to institutions. As mentioned by community member Sissy Austin on our live stream today, we remember the beautiful and heartbreaking songs of Uncle Archie Roach. I also wanted to open up the opportunity with for you to, is there anything further you'd like to share with Aboriginal people who are listening in today? Again, precursing that they may not have had the opportunity to read your statements. And then secondary to your own membership about the commitment moving forward. So first to our people, is there anything further you'd like to share?
Just echoing your statement, Commissioner Lovett, I would just want to reiterate the apologies to First Nations peoples who were traumatised and dispossessed. That cultural genocide piece I spoke of earlier, I just want to acknowledge the truth of that and offer our commitment to continue to work towards reparation.
So I just might echo the acknowledgement in our statement around the importance with which the Archdiocese holds the Yoorrook Justice Commission in investigating and reporting on historical and ongoing systemic injustices perpetrated against First Peoples within the state of Victoria. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be part of this today.
And I would also like to acknowledge the intergenerational harm and the harm that has come from the involvement of churches in missions and the injustice that we're recognising in terms of land injustice and the consequent intergenerational injustice. So we certainly acknowledge that. Did you want us to speak to our membership in the same?
Could I just add one more thing? To the First Nations people, I would like to also acknowledge your continued willingness to be speaking with us, as evidenced by being present today, but also in terms of the willingness to be consulted, say, for example, through the Wurundjeri Council and so on in many different ways. And I just want to acknowledge that because it's an incredible sign of grace. And I just want to acknowledge that.
And I think just the secondary comment about not just people who are attending church, but just society more broadly. Aboriginal people carry a significant load and trauma, but also the resistance. We've resisted since day one. But what is your role in the ongoing education, but also in society more broadly about truth-telling, but also what needs to change? Anyone can go first. No preference. Still approach from Council earlier.
Perhaps, Commissioner Lovett, if I could respond in terms of the way you invited us to speak to our membership, if I could respond in those terms.
And then more broadly, the Victorian community, if that's okay as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess to our own membership, I would want to take this opportunity to remind ourselves that we are on stolen land, and to recognise the importance of acknowledging country in all that we do, hearing the truth, such as is being brought to light through this commission for those who perhaps haven't investigated this fully before now. It's really important for us to hear this and to look forward for more just outcomes for First Peoples, recognising the intergenerational harm that has come about. So I would say that to our membership, and to the Victorian people, I would equally encourage engagement with this understanding of what has happened, what is the history of this these lands now called Victoria, and to engage with the recommendations from this commission, and to work forward towards treaty and truth. And we look forward to walking together for a better outcome for all of our children and all of our people.
To our own people, I would ask that we remember that so much of what we take for granted is on stolen land, is built on the lie of terra nullius, on the original sin of Australia's colonisation, and to take to heart the spiritual nature of that. And as Bishop John McIntyre, one of my predecessors, said, the unhealed wound that lies at the heart of our church and our nation. And until we really face into that, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. As a church and society tradition, I guess I would say to the wider community that the church wants to be part of a society-wide solution or a way of means of addressing this problem with the advice of the Yoorrook Justice Commission, that we do not seek to have a separate jurisdiction, that we want to work with you, and we look forward to the outcomes of this process in which we feel very privileged to have been invited to participate.
I think what I would add to what Bishop Richard said in terms of to our own membership, in terms of the importance of confronting truth and history, is also the recognition that that can be painful, that it's important to sit with, but also to recognise that moving forward justly costs, and that part of the that will only make sense if one sits with truth. And so I just would say that to our membership. And the other to the wider society is to recognise and to own the fact that as the Christian Church, we have been complicit in that injustice, but at the same time want to move forward and be part of the solution, and recognise that whereas other peoples have come later, we are part of that story from the start of that injustice.
Thank you. My last question is about truth, but also treaty, and you've all mentioned it. Have you thought about whether there should be settlement agreements or treaties between your church and First Peoples, whose country your churches operate on?
You'll be aware from the submission that the cathedral, our home church of the diocese, and I'm of the province, sorry, and I'm a member of the chapter of the cathedral, has made that commitment. I think to date, commitment to treaty, but I think to furthering that, advocating for it. In terms of the detail you mentioned, I don't think there has been detailed discussion to this point. There has been the request from our subcommittee, because it's only a recent commitment that we've made, for them to make recommendations to us for the chapter to consider. So I think the short answer to your question is, it's not that it's simply that there hasn't been consideration to that detail to this point.
But you're open to it is probably the point.
Correct.
I'm trying to understand.
Yes. Should there be? Yes. Yes.
Commissioner, likewise, we have not given consideration to a treaty between the church and traditional owners as such, as much as we support the treaty process. However, if that's, we would certainly be open to considering that. And obviously that would need to work through various governance things, but we would absolutely be open to considering that.
Thank you. Thanks.
I don't know if Mr. Leary, you wanted to mention anything at that point.
I would just, that's not something that we have considered. I'm not aware that it's something that we have considered at this point.
Open to considering it?
I think the Archbishop indicated that he was open to considering the issue of treaty, what form or what shape that takes.
Yeah, well, I think there's two different parts. There's the treaty with the state, and what I'm talking about is a treaty directly with the church. So we need to seek clarity on that, and maybe that one can be taken on notice. Thanks.
Certainly.
Mr. Goodwin, the land injustice block is about to conclude, possibly at the end of this session, and during the hearings, we have heard, particularly from government, many statements of acceptance of the injustice of the past. And I treat those as having been genuine expressions, and that is a considerable advance for our society in Victoria. What was often lacking in the evidence of the state was any commitment to actions apart from policies and frameworks and pieces of paper. And there was, I think, revealed a fairly unhappy state of inconclusiveness about many of the policies. We come here today on probably the last day, hearing evidence from conscience leaders of our society, and again the same acceptance of the truth about the past, but again, and in fact more so, a shattering silence about actions to redress it taken internally on your own initiative. I find that really saddening, and I'm hoping, against hope, that this commission at least will spur organisations like yours that have leadership of the conscience of our community at heart to look within the organisations for ways of tangibly addressing. Now, there have been some small movements that have been referred to, but this is a shattering overall impression of, at least mine, from this block of hearings, that we've had many expressions of genuine acceptance of the past, but no effective ways of addressing them despite those good feelings. Treaty is one answer. It is not the only answer. So I hope that my expectations of a change come to fruition.
Yes, and then I've got no questions. It only remains to adjourn.
I just have a comment. I don't expect a response. And Commissioner Lovett brought this up, and it just reminded me that Uncle Archie, and I hope I don't get emotional, who couldn't give evidence, he took the pain and the hurt inflicted by the churches in his song to the world. So there's just, I'm going to do this for him. And I want you to reflect on this. They fenced us in like sheep and said to us, come take our hand. They set us up on mission land, taught us to read, to write and pray. Then they took our children away. I just want to leave you with that, because he's unable to do that. And in saying that, that evidence today concludes Yoorrook's injustice hearings. Yoorrook will resume hearings at the end of this month as part of the inquiry into health, education, housing and economic life. And thank all those who supported Yoorrook's hearings processes. First of all, Commissioner Lovett for his strength and leadership with the Yoorrook's Land Injustice Inquiry. To the Yoorrook staff, in particular the leadership from our First Nations people, who even got us out on country. So thank you to them for that. For our council assisting, thank you. Solicitors assisting, thank you. Our technical team who handle all the live streaming and recording and when we turn our microphones off. Our Auslis interpreters online, our contracted videographers and photographers, thank you. All the witnesses, particularly First Nations who come at the detriment to themselves. The other Victorians who also fronted the commission. They've taken the time to prepare material and appear before this commission. And finally, traditional owners and First Peoples who have provided invaluable evidence, shared their experiences that will form part of Yoorrook's official public record. And to all those who have listened in online, we thank you. Thank you. That's the end of today's hearings.